November 1944. The edge of the Hürtgen forest. The temperature is hovering just above freezing, turning the ground into a half-frozen paste of mud and shattered pine. Some are violently venting black smoke, others are simply dead, their tracks blown apart, their suspensions collapsed. But the American system pushed heavy maintenance as far forward as the artillery umbrella would tolerate. A broken piece of hardware did not automatically mean sending the vehicle to a depot in France. If a mounting bracket snapped, a machinist turned on his truck-mounted lathe, measured the tolerances, and carved a replacement from steel stock, while the earth vibrated from distant mortar strikes. It was a mobile assembly line running in reverse. But mechanical skill has a strict physical limit. A master welder can seal a fractured hull, and a machinist can manufacture a missing steel pin. They cannot, however, forge a completely new transmission in a muddy tent. They cannot cast a massive, multi-ton final drive assembly from raw iron. To rebuild a shattered machine in a matter of hours, the wrenches needed exact, precision-engineered components, and tracking down a specific 300-pound gearbox in the middle of a destroyed European forest required an entirely different kind of system. Just a few yards away from the sparks of the welding torches, inside a canvas tent shivering in the winter wind, sits a soldier whose weapon is entirely different. He does not hold a wrench or a cutting torch. He holds a grease-stained, heavy paper binder. The commander writes his after-action report with absolute confidence. He knows the strict, unforgiving arithmetic of mechanized warfare. He is the unit supply clerk, and he controls the invisible nervous system of the American armored effort. While mechanics drop a shattered transmission into the mud outside, the shop foreman walks into the tent, shouting over the roar of the generators. He needs a replacement gear assembly, a specific drive shaft, or a starter motor. The clerk does not panic, nor does he wire a frantic plea to a factory across the Atlantic. Instead, he opens the standard nomenclature, lists the Ordnance Department's master catalog. This book is the operational code of American industrial supremacy. In other militaries, replacing a heavy component could be a nightmare of bespoke engineering. A German mechanic trying to fix a knocked-out tank often discovered that a part manufactured in early 1943 would not fit a chassis built in late 1944. Hand-fitted armor and constant, localized design tweaks meant that replacement parts frequently required custom machining just to be installed. The American system operates on the rigid law of absolute standardization. Every single bolt, bearing, road wheel, and engine valve across the entire military inventory has a standardized ordnance part number. When the foreman asks for a part, the clerk flips through the freezing, damp pages under the glare of a drop light. He is looking for a specific alphanumeric code. But the true genius of the catalog is not just organization. An armored company relies on mass and momentum. When you violently remove 7 fighting vehicles from a single tactical formation, you do not just kill tanks. It is interchangeability. The M10 tank destroyer, for example, is not a completely unique, isolated machine. Beneath its sloped armor, its lower hull and running gear are largely identical to the M4A2 Sherman tank. If the battalion depot is out of M10 specific drive sprockets, the clerk simply cross-references the book. He finds the identical part number listed under the Sherman inventory. He fills out a requisition form, hands it to a runner, and within hours, a supply truck navigates the dark, rutted roads from the rear echelon, dropping a heavy wooden crate stenciled with the exact matching digits. Pry open the crate, and the pristine, factory-oiled component drops perfectly into the shattered space of the dead vehicle. No custom grinding, no hand-fitting. The bolt holes align exactly, the gear teeth mesh flawlessly. This is how a severed engine block is replaced in the field. The clerk tracks millions of interchangeable parts, moving in a constant, invisible river of logistics from the ports of France directly to the muddy tents behind the front line. It is a paper-based system that allows field mechanics to reassemble vehicles like massive, lethal puzzles. By the early hours of the morning, the heavy wooden crates have been emptied. The mechanics torque the final bolts on the new transmission. The M10, mathematically destroyed just yesterday, fires its twin diesels. You break the unit. In the traditional rules of war, a shattered engine block is a permanent kill, coughing blue smoke into the frozen air. The system has worked, but this entire ecosystem, the catalogs, the requisition forms, the steady arrival of supply trucks relies on one fragile assumption. It assumes the roads behind the unit are open. It assumes the rear depots have the parts in stock. The catalog is only a piece of paper if the required component simply does not exist in the immediate theater. And in the brutal reality of winter combat, a mechanic staring at an empty supply crate cannot wait for a truck that has been delayed by destroyed bridges. When the supply chain is severed, the mechanics must find another way to resurrect the dead. The supply chain is a luxury. In combat, luxuries vanish. A bridge washes out under heavy rain. A rear echelon depot is targeted by a nighttime Luftwaffe raid. Or, most commonly, the specific part listed in the clerk's catalogue is simply out of stock across the entire European theatre. The requisition form goes out, but nothing comes back. When the logistical river runs dry, the motor pool does not stop working. Instead, the mechanics turn to the darkest, most pragmatic rule of American armored maintenance: doctrinal cannibalization. In the muddy clearing, an M10 is dragged in by the recovery team. This one is different from the others. A cracked turret ring or a severely warped hull means the vehicle requires factory-level reconstruction. For the German forces, a high-velocity shell has struck the ammunition storage. The internal fire has raged for hours. The steel hull is visibly warped, the temper of the metal permanently destroyed by intense heat. The battalion maintenance officer inspects the charred chassis and makes a final judgment. He declares the vehicle Class X. It is totally destroyed, beyond all economical repair. It will never fight again. But to the mechanics, a dead vehicle is not a coffin. It is a parts warehouse. While the hull is compromised, the physics of armored combat dictate that not every component dies at once. The engine block might be slag, but the transmission housing in the lower front bow survived intact. The turret might be cracked, but the heavily machined elevation gears are pristine. The right track is shattered, but the left track assembly, the heavy bogie wheels, and the suspension springs are in perfect working order. The mechanics descend on the ruined hulk. They use heavy wrenches and cutting torches to aggressively amputate the surviving organs. They do not bother being gentle with the ruined hull. They slice through the charred armor just to get faster access to the pristine fuel pumps, the undamaged radio sets, and the starter motors. 50 yards away sits another M10. Severely damaged armor must often be loaded onto specialized rail cars and shipped hundreds of miles back to heavy industrial dry docks in the homeland. This one suffered a relatively minor hit. A shell shattered its suspension and tore apart its left track, but the crew and the hull survived. Under normal circumstances, this tank destroyer would wait days for replacement bogies and track links to arrive from a rear depot. Tonight, it will not wait at all. The mechanics hoist the heavy, mud-caked suspension assembly from the dead donor vehicle. They drag it across the freezing ground and bolt it directly onto the crippled recipient. They connect the track pins. They adjust the tension. By midnight, 2 broken machines have been merged into one operational killer. This was not desperate, unauthorized scavenging. It was an officially recognized system. The Ordnance Department understood that the fastest supply line in the world was the 50 yards between two broken vehicles. By officially permitting frontline units to cannibalize their dead, the American military created a self-sustaining loop of repair. A German anti-tank gunner might successfully destroy an American vehicle, completely unaware that his kill would immediately provide the exact spare parts needed to resurrect 3 other lightly damaged machines sitting out of his line of sight. This localized patchwork system is what allowed the battalion to reappear at full strength just 48 hours after the Hurtgen ambush. The commander naturally assumes the Americans are bound by the same iron law of logistics. A destroyed M10 requires a replacement from an assembly line. The mechanics absorbed the attrition, recycled the casualties, and returned the steel to the line. But this ecosystem relied on a specific set of battlefield conditions. It required a stationary front, a secure motor pool, and enough time for the recovery crews to operate in the dark. The true test of this mechanical network had not yet arrived. What would happen when the static front violently collapsed? The motor pools were forced into retreat, and winter weather completely erased the supply lines. The 16th of December, 1944. The Ardennes forest. The temperature plunges, freezing the mud into solid ridges of ice. The sky is locked in heavy overcast, grounding the Allied air cover. Suddenly, the static front line disintegrates under a massive German artillery barrage. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. 3 German armies punch through the American lines. The secure encampments of the ordnance maintenance companies previously operating a safe 2 miles. Behind the fighting suddenly find the war collapsing directly onto them. German panzer spearheads overrun the supply routes. Heavy snow buries the roads. The orderly ecosystem of the parts clock is instantly severed. This is the ultimate stress test. A maintenance network that relies on safe rear areas and predictable logistics will shatter under a massive, unexpected retreat. But the American system was built around a mobile philosophy in Michigan, thousands of miles away. By the laws of attrition, this specific American sector is now neutralized. As the front line falls backward, the motor pools do not panic. The heavy shop trucks secure their lathes, drill presses, and welding rigs in minutes. Crucially, they do not abandon the damaged armor. The M32 recovery crews hook their cables to the crippled M10S and the newer, faster M18 Hellcats. They drag the dead weight backward through the snow, operating in reverse, staying just 1 step ahead of the advancing enemy. This fighting retreat demands armor. Tank destroyers are the only immediate defense against the heavy German armor rushing toward the Meuse River. Every single gun is desperately needed at the critical crossroads. When a Hellcat is disabled by a German shell while holding a defensive line, it is not abandoned to the enemy. It is dragged just over the next ridge. The mechanics drop into the freezing snow. There are no canvas tents to block the wind. There are no drop lights. There are certainly no new supply crates arriving from the rear. Wrenches freeze to bare hands. Heavy gear oil solidifies into a useless paste, operating in sub-zero temperatures, fighting severe frostbite. The mechanics execute their cannibalization doctrine on the run. They ruthlessly strip the hopeless wrecks. They pull heavy bogie wheels, fuel pumps, and intact optical sights from doomed vehicles, bolting them directly onto salvageable chassis while artillery lands in the next valley over. 48 hours later, the winter mist breaks. The German lines are assaulted again. The commander raises his binoculars. If a hopelessly damaged tank destroyer absolutely cannot be towed any further, it is stripped of every vital organ. Only then is the empty hull wired with thermite grenades and permanently destroyed, ensuring the advancing Germans capture nothing of value. The system does not break, it simply compresses. The maintenance units form a rolling, self-sustaining factory, keeping the American tank destroyer battalions functional during the most desperate weeks of the winter. The vehicles defending critical junctions are kept alive by this relentless, localized recycling of steel. As the weeks pass and the massive German offensive eventually stalls, their forward commanders observe the battlefield. They capture abandoned American repair sites. They inspect the hollowed-out, cannibalized donor wrecks left in the snow. They finally see the invisible machinery that has been resurrecting the American armor. The secret is out, but understanding the mechanism is not the same as possessing it. The German military can see the results. They know exactly how the Americans are doing it. Yet, even with the blueprint laid bare in the snow, copying the method is physically impossible for them. To understand why, we have to look at the machinery the German mechanics were forced to repair. A German mechanic kneels in the Ardennes snow, staring at the running gear of a stranded Panther tank. The vehicle has not been destroyed by enemy combat. Expecting to see unsupported infantry or perhaps a fresh armored division diverted from another sector. Instead, he sees the same silhouettes. A single inner road wheel has shattered on the frozen terrain, and the final drive has sheared a gear under the extreme stress of the mud. By the American standard, this is a temporary mobility kill. The vehicle should be fighting again by morning. For the German crew, it is a death sentence for the machine. The German mechanic is highly trained, but his own vehicle is fighting against him. The Panther was designed with a complex, interleaved suspension system. These large, overlapping steel wheels were engineered to provide a remarkably smooth ride and perfectly distribute the 45-ton weight of the tank. But to reach the single shattered inner wheel, the mechanic must painstakingly unbolt and remove up to 5 heavy outer wheels. He does not have an M32 recovery vehicle, with an 18-foot boom crane idling nearby. He is fighting the physics of the machine in the freezing wind, using hand jacks that sink immediately into the earth. Even if he manages to clear the suspension, he faces the fractured final drive. He locates a heavily damaged donor Panther abandoned a mile down the road and attempts to cannibalize the required gear assembly. Here, he collides with a fatal flaw in the German industrial philosophy. The donor vehicle was manufactured in a different facility 5 months earlier. A German anti-tank battery, hidden in a prepared tree line, waits for the sound of heavy engines. At 800 meters, the shapes finally appear. They are American tank destroyers, moving aggressively through the mud, returning fire. As they close the distance, the optics reveal an impossibility. Because German factories constantly introduced localized design modifications and relied heavily on skilled artisans hand-fitting components, the parts are not perfectly interchangeable. The bolt patterns are slightly misaligned. The teeth of the gears do not mesh flawlessly. To make the cannibalized part work, it must be carefully ground and machined to fit. In the middle of a fighting retreat, under the threat of advancing infantry, that level of bespoke engineering is impossible. The German maintenance network cannot save the tank. The mechanic cannot repair it in the field. The vehicle cannot be easily towed, because dragging a dead Panther through the snow requires up to 3 heavy prime movers chained together, a logistical luxury that does not exist at the collapsing front. It requires a factory-level dry dock to undergo heavy reconstruction, and the rail network leading back to the homeland has been pulverized by Allied bombers. The climax of this specific mechanical failure is absolute. It is not an explosion. It is the moment the crew simply runs out of options. They drop a thermite grenade into the fighting compartment, permanently destroying an exquisite, terrifying masterpiece of military engineering over a broken gear. Then, they walk east into the snow. This was the invisible barrier the opposing forces could not cross. They designed brilliant, over-engineered, individual weapons. They bear the exact same divisional bumper codes. He counts the vehicles in the formation. The unit is operating at full combat strength. The Americans designed an imperfect, highly standardized, resilient system. The German command could see the American recovery network operating in the captured clearings, but they could not copy it. Their own vehicles were too heavy, too complex, and too bespoke to be maintained under a canvas tent. A lightly damaged German tank was frequently abandoned by its own crew. A heavily damaged American tank destroyer was routinely dragged out of the mud, amputated, rebuilt with identical drop-in parts, and thrown back into the line. The result was a massive divergence in operational readiness. One side bled armor it could not replace, while the other absorbed staggering physical losses and simply reassembled the pieces. This mechanical ecosystem allowed the American forces to survive the brutal arithmetic of the campaign. But what was the ultimate impact of this invisible advantage on the final outcome of the war? To understand the true verdict of this attrition, we must return to the opening ambush and look at the human cost required to make the mathematics work. The German battery commander in the Hürtgen forest recorded a decisive victory in his logbook. When he watched the American column shatter, he applied the only mathematics he understood. In his experience, 30 tons of burning steel left abandoned in the winter mud. The mathematics of the battlefield have just failed him. The steel he saw shatter, the engines he saw burn, seemed to have undone their own destruction, was a permanent reduction of enemy combat power. He believed he had broken a battalion. He did not realize he had simply delivered raw materials to a mobile factory operating just beyond the tree line. The question was never really about the raw thickness of armor plate or the muzzle velocity of an anti-tank gun. It was about a deeper system of resilience. In the brutal attrition of the Western Front, the deciding factor was not who could build the most perfect, impenetrable fighting vehicle. It was who could absorb catastrophic violence, drag the broken pieces out of the fire, and rebuild them faster than the enemy could reload. The German military fought a war of bespoke mechanical masterpieces, where a single sheared gear in a heavy forest could force a crew to abandon their vehicle forever. The Americans fought an industrial war of standardized components, where a vehicle was never truly dead as long as its chassis could be towed. The opposing forces could see the devastating results of this capability, but they could not replicate the vast, unglamorous infrastructure required to sustain it. But calling it an infrastructure makes it sound automatic. It was not. The resurrection of the armored forces was not a theoretical exercise, and it did not happen on clean factory floors. It was a brutal, exhausting, and highly dangerous physical reality. The logical assumption for the German command is that the Americans simply possess an endless, wasteful reserve of brand new vehicles waiting just out of sight. The survival of the American tank destroyer battalions was purchased with frostbite, crushed limbs, and severe sleep deprivation. Before a mechanic could weld a patch over a shattered hull, he often had to wash the frozen blood of the previous crew out of the fighting compartment. These men worked in the mud, breathing the sharp stench of burnt diesel, scorched paint, and cordite. They manipulated heavy steel cables with numb hands, knowing that a snapped winch line under 60,000 pounds of tension could kill a man instantly. The system only existed because of the people operating inside it. It was the driver of the M32 armored recovery vehicle, inching his unlit machine toward a live kill zone while listening for the whistle of incoming artillery. It was the supply clerk sitting in a canvas tent, frantically cross-referencing thousands of interchangeable part numbers by the dim glow of a flashlight. It was the former civilian machinist who spent his nights carving replacement pins on a truck-mounted lathe while the earth shook from distant mortar strikes. These men did not paint white kill rings on the barrels of their weapons. They did not receive the headlines in the wartime press. Their victories were recorded entirely in grease-stained logistics ledgers and completed repair tickets. Yet, they were the fundamental reason the American frontline. They assume a flood of pristine replacement steel has been driven straight from the ports of France to fill the gaps, never permanently fractured under pressure. They were the ghost army of the motor pool. When the campaigns finally ended, the abandoned husks of heavy German armor littered the European countryside, left exactly where they had broken down. But the American machines kept moving. The true victory of the armored war was not decided simply by the guns. It was decided in the freezing dark, by men covered in heavy grease, listening to the metallic groan of a winch pulling dead steel out of the mud, refusing to let the machine die. But that assumption is completely wrong. No new tank destroyers have been delivered to this unit. The vehicles rolling toward the German guns are, in several cases, the exact same machines that were left bleeding oil in the mud 2 days prior. To understand how a shattered formation resurrected itself in less than 48 hours, we first need to look at what happened the moment the original American crews bailed out and the front line fell silent. The smoke over the Hurtgen road has not even cleared before a completely different kind of American machinery begins to move. When the surviving tank destroyer crews scramble back through the tree line, leaving their broken M10s behind, they do not just report combat losses to their command post. It is a column of American M10 tank destroyers, their open-topped turrets exposed, their tracks slipping in the winter terrain. They report mechanical symptoms: a thrown track, a jammed turret ring, a shattered drive sprocket leaking heavy grease into the soil. The German gunners, looking through their optics, see dead metal. The American crews retreating through the mud see a repair ticket. There was a persistent myth, both during the war and long after, that the United States Army relied on a simple strategy of endless overproduction. The assumption was that if an armored vehicle was knocked out on a Tuesday, a brand new replacement rolled off a transport ship on a Wednesday to take its place. But logistics do not move at the speed of an artillery shell. Shipping a 30-ton tank destroyer from a factory floor in Flint, Michigan, across the Atlantic Ocean, unloading it at a fractured European port, and driving it over ruined rail networks to a specific frozen forest took months. If frontline commanders waited for Detroit to replace every battlefield loss, armored battalions would evaporate in a matter of weeks. The American military understood that true endurance required more than just building vehicles. It required a shadow industry that followed the troops. The answer to the German ambush did not come from across the ocean. It came from a camouflaged encampment sitting roughly 2 miles behind the line of contact. The ambush is mathematically precise. The high-velocity 75mm shells from the German Pak 40S crossed the distance in less than a second. This was the battalion motor pool, the first tier of the Ordnance Department's forward maintenance network. The clock on the American recovery system started ticking the second the tracks stopped moving. The disabled vehicles were not immediately written off. Instead, they were precisely categorized. An M10 with a hole punched through its engine block was an automotive casualty. One with a smashed gun tube was an ordnance casualty. A vehicle with a shattered suspension was a mobility kill. Within hours of the ambush, a maintenance scout creeps forward to the edge of the battlefield, often while the area is still taking intermittent mortar fire. The scout is not looking for enemy troop movements. He is performing triage on steel, sliding into the freezing mud next to the disabled machines. He inspects the damage. He checks if the hull has been structurally warped by heat. He examines the transmission housing for fatal cracks. If the vehicle was completely consumed by internal ammunition explosions, it is finally declared dead. But if the underlying chassis is sound, the machine is marked for salvation. In this specific engagement, the Scout makes the determination. The damaged vehicles can be saved. The mechanics waiting 2 miles back have the tools, the welding torches, and the replacement parts ready to undo the damage of the German shells. The results are immediate and brutal. Armor-piercing projectiles punch through the angled steel plates of the M10S. But that diagnosis only creates a much more immediate problem. Knowing an armored vehicle can be repaired is entirely different from actually repairing it. Mechanics cannot lift a 2-ton engine block, run a welding torch, or swing a sledgehammer in the middle of an active kill zone, perfectly exposed to the same German guns that just shattered the column. Before the wrenches can be turned, the dead steel must be dragged back to the tools. Moving 30 tons of paralyzed mud-suctioned armor away from the front line without losing more men to enemy crosshairs requires a completely different kind of warfare. Nightfall changes the geometry of the battlefield. The temperature drops further, locking the shattered pine branches in frost and freezing the mud around the road wheels of the abandoned M10S. The German gunners cannot see the road, but they are awake, listening, and have pre-registered the coordinates for artillery. In this blind spot, underneath the constant threat of indirect fire, the American recovery crews begin their work. They are the graveyard shift of the armored war. You cannot quietly move 30 tons of steel. Furthermore, a tank destroyer with a shattered suspension sinking into freezing mud does not simply weigh 30 tons. The vacuum suction of the earth and the drag of broken tracks effectively double the required pulling force. Kinetic energy converts to heat, spalling hot metal through crew compartments, snapping drive shafts, and igniting fuel lines. A standard transport truck would simply snap its own axles, attempting to budge it, to drag dead armor out of the kill zone. The United States Army engineered a machine specifically designed for battlefield extraction, the M32 Armored Recovery Vehicle. The M32 was not built to fight, though it was born from combat. It was constructed on the hull of a Sherman tank, but its turret had been removed and replaced with an 18-foot A-frame boom crane capable of lifting 30,000 pounds. Buried deep inside its armored chassis was a specialized Garwood winch that could drag 60,000 pounds of dead weight. It was a frontline tow truck, armored against shrapnel and carrying a highly trained crew of mechanics. The recovery team inches the M32 forward in absolute darkness. Headlights are strictly forbidden. The driver navigates by the faint, jagged outlines of the trees and the sharp scent of spilled diesel. When they reach the crippled tank destroyer, the crew dismounts into the freezing slush. This is the most dangerous phase of the operation. Before they can tow, they must rig. If a broken track is wrapped violently around a drive sprocket, they must cut it away with an oxyacetylene torch. The crack of the guns is followed by the heavy, metallic groan of 30-ton machines dying in the mud, desperately hiding the bright flame under heavy tarps so the enemy observers do not spot the glare. Then they wrestle heavy towing cables thick as a man's wrist, stiff with cold, and coated in grease onto the towing pintles of the dead M10. The men work with numb hands, fighting against the heavy steel loops, listening constantly for the incoming whistle of mortar fire. Once the rigging is locked, the operator engages the power takeoff for the winch. The radial engine of the M32 roars. In the quiet of the frozen forest, the mechanical noise feels terrifyingly loud. The thick steel cable snaps taut, groaning under the immense strain. For a long second, the dead M10 refuses to yield. The frozen earth fights to keep its prize. Then, with a violent, metallic crack, the mud suction breaks. The crippled tank destroyer lurches backward, dragging its broken tracks like chains. By dawn, the recovery crews have pulled the mangled machines out of the artillery zone, down the rutted trails, and into the camouflaged encampment of the motor pool. The extraction is a success. The machines have been saved from permanent capture, but getting the vehicles out of the mud is only the first step. The sun rises over a collection of bleeding metal. Within 20 minutes, the engagement is over. The American column reverses desperately, leaving its casualties behind. Armor plates are pierced, drive shafts are snapped, engine bays are contaminated with steel shrapnel. A civilian garage would immediately declare these vehicles unsalvageable scrap. To fulfill the German commander's worst nightmare and return these machines to the fight within hours, the American mechanics will need to perform heavy industrial fabrication in the middle of a frozen tent. The muddy clearing 2 miles behind the line is no longer a quiet encampment. As the damaged tank destroyers are dragged in, the space transforms into a roaring industrial park. The American Ordnance Maintenance Company did not simply repair vehicles, it relocated a miniature Detroit machine shop directly into the combat zone. To the untrained eye, it is chaos. Tarps are strung between splintered pine trees. The ground is churned into a brown slurry. Exhaust fumes and the sharp stench of ozone choke the morning air. But there is a strict factory floor logic to the layout. Heavy shop trucks back into position around the wounded armor. These are not standard transport vehicles carrying simple hand tools. When their heavy side panels fold down, they reveal industrial-grade machinery. The trucks carry heavy-duty lathes, electric drill presses, bench grinders, and hydraulic presses. Thick rubber power cables snake through the freezing mud. The German battery commander scans the smoking road through his optics. He counts 7 disabled M10s, feeding electricity from portable generators to heavy arc welding rigs. The men operating these tools wear grease-stained coveralls over their winter uniforms. They are not just soldiers handed a wrench. Many are former rail yard welders, civilian machinists, and factory auto workers. They understand the anatomy of heavy metal. One disabled M10 sits with its rear armor violently deformed, the internal power plant shattered by spalling steel. The mechanics do not waste time attempting to patch the ruined block. They maneuver a heavy wrecker alongside the hull. Mechanics slide into the cramped engine bay, their hands numb from the cold, rapidly disconnecting fuel lines, coolant hoses, and heavy mounting bolts. Then the wrecker's winch engages. With a deep whine of straining cables, they hoist the massive twin diesel engine assembly weighing thousands of pounds. Straight up and out of the chassis, lowering the bleeding metal onto heavy timber stands in the mud. At the next vehicle over, a welder drops his hood. He uses a cutting torch to slice away the jagged, weakened edges of an armor-piercing shell hole. Sparks cascade into the snow. Once the hole is squared off, he prepares to weld a clean patch of steel directly over the wound, sealing the breach. This level of invasive, heavy surgery was something opposing armies usually reserved for specialized rear echelon rail yards.